Okay. We're good? Okay. All right. Whoa, that's a little bit loud. Welcome to Ratio Christi. This is week 13, if you can believe it. We're a week away from Thanksgiving break already. And so because of that, because UNL does not have classes next Wednesday, there will be no Ratio Christi next Wednesday either, because we'll probably all be going home or doing other things. So this is kind of the last week of our traditional Ratio Christi format for this semester. So we're kind of going to cap off the study of who is Jesus, and we'll have the final conclusion, tying up loose ends and all of that in this lecture. A little bit of the schedule going forward. We are done with tabling this semester, except for one more time. That will be December, I think it's 4th. It's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. That's what I know. So that's the last tabling in the City Campus Union of the semester, if you're interested in that. Let's see. No Ratio Christi next week. The week after that, on December 4th, I believe it is. So I guess the tabling will be on the 3rd. December 4th will be movie night. So we'll be watching Case for Christ, which was the movie that came out, I think, last year about the conversion of Lee Strobel, who's written, The Case for Christ. That's his most famous book, the Case for series of books. So that'll be movie night. It'll be happening at Adam and Kristen's house, which is at 3245 T Street. So just take Vine out here all the way down to 33rd, and then it's kind of right about a block south. So next week, 2 weeks from now, 6 o'clock, 3245 T Street. And dinner, that's right. So starting at 6 o'clock, and there'll be, Adam and Kristen will provide dinner for anybody who comes. So look forward to that. Then after that, so I think it's December 11th, this will be the Wednesday of Dead Week. We will be, I think, back here, right? Or have we decided on location for that one yet? We'll be here. We'll be here, and it'll be kind of a Christmas party / game night, and we'll see what our very own Sam, who is not here, but Sam Carey, some of you know him, he's going to kind of head up what we're doing that night. So it's going to be kind of a fun, social night during Dead Week. So most of you know about food over there. A lot of end of the semester stuff that I'm trying to think of. I think I got everything. But thanks for being here tonight. You kind of are giving up on some other really exhilarating events. We have our 600th Democratic debate tonight, so you're missing out on that. You're also missing out on 0 and 11, I think, Akron playing Miami of Ohio tonight. So exhilarating game there too. Some of you may know that Adam is the regional director for Ratio Christi, which means he's not just the chapter director for here at University of Lincoln, Nebraska, but also Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and then most recently South Dakota was added to that region. And so you might want to pray for Adam, because South Dakota just released one of their new logos this week, and it's really captivating. Part of their anti-meth campaign was that design. Now they're kind of going for the shock value there, but it might be admitting more than they wanted to. So anyway, I found that so funny this week. I just had to share it. I was laughing pretty hard.
Ratio Christi's got a lot of work to do in South Dakota.
Yeah, so you'll want to pray for Adam that we can really get these chapters started so we can combat that. Anyway, bit of humor. So I can't do it. So anyway, with no further announcements and then without a lot of further ado, we'll bring up Adam Johnson to give the final lecture in the Who is Jesus series.
Keep my open lid coffee very far away from my computer. That's one of my worst fears. Has anybody done that before? Like spilled their drink on their laptop? I have nightmares about that. So I'm very anal about keeping any food or drink away from. And then I've had folks, over to my house, or if I've had my laptop out and somebody else has a drink and they're looking at something with me and they're just drinking right here, and I'm just like, it's killing me watching them to do it. I'm too polite to say anything. Testing 1, 2. Joel might have to adjust it back there. Testing 1, 2, 3. Well, check in with us on Facebook and utilize social media to help us get the word out. As I often say, we're here to serve people, but we can't help people if they don't know about us. So we utilize social media. We use all sorts of ways to get the word out about Ratio Christi and what we're doing to try to help folks and serve them. As Joel mentioned, we are wrapping up our semester theme tonight. Our theme has been, Who is Jesus? Every semester we have a different topic that we focus on. Last spring it was the existence of God, and this fall it's been specifically looking at Jesus. Of course, as a Christian organization, we are spending most of our time making the case that Jesus is God. Before we just, in the spring, argued that there is a God, but now we want to be specific to Christianity and make the case for the Christian God, if you will, that Jesus is God. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to wrap up the semester by doing a little bit of review, but I also have some new information for you tonight, so I think you'll enjoy it if you've been here this semester. But if you're new, this is a great time to jump in because we're doing some review as well. Now, one way that I like to set up this lecture is to use the hypothetical situation of somebody coming up to you on the street and claiming either that they're God or that they have a friend who they believe is God. So let's do the latter. Let's say you're walking down the street and somebody comes up to you and says they have a friend, let's call him Joshua, they have a friend named Josh who is God in the flesh. Now, I would imagine if that would happen to you, you would be extremely skeptical. I would be. I wouldn't be able to, because I believe that there is a supreme being, I believe that there is a God. I wouldn't be able to exclude the possibility completely, right? But I would be very, very skeptical about this person, Josh, really being God, right? I wouldn't completely exclude the possibility, but I would be skeptical. I'd want to ask some questions, right? So I think the key question would be, what reasons do you have for me to think that this guy, Joshua, really is God? What reasons or evidence would you have, right? I think that'd be the key question. Well, let's say the person on the street tells you that over 2 billion people in the world believe that this guy, Josh, is God in the flesh. That would be impressive. Obviously, it doesn't guarantee it's true. 2 billion people can be wrong, obviously. However, now the person on the street has at least got my attention, right? At least they have my attention. I'm willing to listen to more. Let's say the person on the street also then says that this person, Josh, is a great moral teacher. And even people who don't think he's God recognize that the moral things he's taught, the moral principles, lessons, the moral issues he's addressed, he's one of the best, if not the best, greatest moral teacher in history. Well, I think the person on the street's making a good case. Let's say the third thing now, the person on the street tells me that this guy, Josh, he also has, as far as we can tell, lived out this moral standard that he teaches perfectly. A lot of great moral teachers throughout history have taught good moral things, but they usually will admit that they don't measure up to that standard that they're communicating, right? But this guy, supposedly, person on the street tells me that there's good reason and evidence to believe that this guy, Josh, has lived out perfectly. Even his enemies couldn't find anything to accuse him of. Let's say fourthly then, the person on the street tells me that this guy, Josh, has been one of the most influential persons who has ever lived. Has caused, the rise and fall of countries and belief systems, and has had more influence on shaping at least Western society, more than any other person in history. I want to read to you something that I think summarizes this really well. Of course, we're talking about Jesus. You understand that, right? There's a reason I chose the name Joshua. Jesus is a form of that Hebrew name, Yeshua, Joshua. But talking about Jesus, he was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. Grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher, a traveling preacher. Never wrote a book, never held any office, never had a family, never owned a home, never went to college, never lived in a big city, never traveled more than 200 miles from the place he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. No credentials, really, at all. When he was only 33, the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away from him. One of them denied him and turned him into the authorities. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a false trial. Nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was buried, laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. Now 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race, arguably. I think it's well within the mark to say that all the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever sat, all the kings that have ever reigned, all put together have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life, and in particular, the 3 years that he traveled around and taught people. So pretty powerful. If you're new to Ratio Christi, what we like to do is get a break from me talking every 15, 20 minutes. And so let's do that now. I want you guys to discuss at your table, of these 4 reasons to believe that Joshua is God, Yeshua, which one do you find the most compelling? Which one do you find the least compelling? I think you guys get the question, so I'll leave it here to remind you of the 4 things we've covered so far. And then we've got 3 more to cover tonight, and we'll be done. All right, so I'll give you 4 or 5 minutes to chat together at your table. Sam, you're going to have a lonely conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to see some of the people in the back.
Yeah, you guys can join them up here. right. Number 5. Let's say, in addition to these things, that the person on the street is able to give you substantial evidence that this person, Joshua, has performed miracles. And this is going to be a chance where we can do a little bit of review, because this was our first major argument that we looked at this semester. We spent, I think, almost 2 months walking through this argument. So bear with me. I know we have a couple new folks here tonight, and some of you might have missed some of the weeks where we were covering this argument. So bear with me, and I'm going to walk you through this argument one last time. So we started off just asking, is there any evidence that this person, Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus, even existed in history? The man. And the resource that I've been pointing y'all to is this book written by an atheist, Bart Ehrman. But he had been asked so many times, did Jesus of Nazareth, as a human being, a man, really exist in history? And he finally just put all the evidence that Jesus really existed 2,000 years ago in a book. And so, written by an atheist, he doesn't believe Jesus is God, but here is evidence that Jesus existed, the person, human person, at a minimum. So this is a good resource to be aware of. And there's good evidence that we looked at that he thought of himself as God, right? Because that's one theory out there, that it wasn't until many decades or even centuries later that his followers created this legend about him being God. No, there's some pretty good, solid historical evidence that he himself claimed to be God. But the question is, why should we believe his claim? It's one thing to say that you're God, but can you back it up? And the reason that we looked at, this particular one, step 5 now, or the 5th point, is that he was able to do miracles. And miracles serve the function of authenticating a claim. In other words, somebody being able to do something miraculous gives them credibility that they really do have a message from God. And his message that he claimed was true was that he himself was God. And so miracles serve that function to back up or authenticate those sort of claims. It's kind of like we use the example of a king in the olden days, where he would have a signet ring and imprint that seal on his letters. It was unique. It was only something that he could do. So then when somebody got that message and it had the king's seal on it, they knew it really was from the king. And that's the function that miracles serve for us. Now, as we went through this argument, we noted that we mostly know about Jesus' miracles from the New Testament. Not exclusively. There's some other non-biblical sources, but mostly we know about his miracles from the New Testament. And that led us to the question, is the New Testament historically reliable? They're ancient documents, but why do we think that they're telling the truth? Why do we think that they're historically reliable? And so we just walked through these last few steps down here, number 4, number 5. And the first thing we had to cover was, well, do we even have an accurate copy of the New Testament? Because some people claim that the New Testament has been corrupted. There's so many mistakes and errors in it that we can't even know for sure that what we use and read has any resemblance at all to what the original New Testament said back in the 1st century. So we had to walk through the reasons why we think we do have an accurate copy. And now we're not going to go through all the details, but I'll just remind you of the finale, right, of this portion of the argument. This is Bruce Metzger. He's like the Michael Jordan of this field, right? Textual criticism. He was a professor at Princeton for decades, very highly respected. And according to Metzger, we can recreate, we don't have the original New Testament, but from all the copies we have, we can recreate the original New Testament with a very high degree of accuracy. According to Metzger, 99.5%, which is impressive for ancient documents. Bart Ehrman, the atheist that I mentioned earlier, says the same thing. So here's a quote from atheist Bart Ehrman's book where he explains he virtually agrees with Metzger. In this quote, I won't read it, you can glance through it if you'd like. He basically says that, look, if Metzger and I were separated and put in a room and told to try to recreate the original New Testament from the copies that we have, we'd pretty much come to the same conclusion. So in other words, it seems to me that this atheist New Testament scholar is affirming that we do have a very accurate copy of the original. Now, it's one thing to have an accurate copy, but the second question we have to ask is, why think that they were telling the truth? Because we might have an accurate copy of a bunch of lies. And so if you remember, the last part of this argument was to walk through several reasons we believe the New Testament authors told the truth. And we spent 3 weeks going through all these reasons. I just want to review 2 of them tonight, the 2 that I find the most powerful or the most compelling. One reason we think they told the truth is that they communicated their claims about the miraculous and specifically about his resurrection very soon after the events. This is impressive to historians, detectives. We talked about how a lot of these similar questions are asked by those in court setting, detectives, lawyers, attorneys, judges. And the fact that the disciples were claiming these miracles and the resurrection of Jesus very soon after the events gives them a lot of credibility. So this is another atheist who agrees, just from historical data that we have, the disciples were proclaiming Jesus' resurrection within 2 years of the cross. So certainly this wasn't a legend that developed over decades or centuries. The other reason that I find very compelling is all of the extra biblical references we have to these things. You might remember that we looked at a few of these. These are non-Christian historians. Some worked for the Roman government. And they were just recording history. Some were Jewish historians. And if you take just what we know about Jesus from these, what were they, 10 non-Christian sources. If, let's say, we didn't even have the New Testament, all we had were these non-biblical, non-Christian sources, we could compile quite a bit of information about Jesus. And all of it confirms the New Testament story. So even though it doesn't give us all the details of the New Testament, it gives the New Testament a tremendous amount of credibility because the key details are affirmed by non-Christian, non-biblical sources. We mentioned when we were walking through this that the fact we have 10 non-Christian sources for the life and events of Jesus means that Jesus of Nazareth is more well attested historically than Julius Caesar, the emperor. So in terms of historical information, we have a lot of data to go on. All right, that moves us down to number 6. We're going through these pretty quick. I know a lot of this is review to most of you. But the 6th one then is, get us back to our hypothetical situation. Somebody comes up to us on the street, claims that they have a friend or they know a person named Joshua who is God in the flesh. They have all these reasons to believe that. And then on top of it, they say this man rose from the dead. And if you remember, this is our second main argument from the semester. We said this is kind of an alternate approach to the previous argument, where we made a case for the historic reliability of the New Testament. This is more, if you will, a more targeted approach. I called it the bullet approach. Think of almost like a sniper, where they're just aiming for that one thing, and that is Jesus' resurrection. So with this approach, all that a person would be doing is focusing on the evidence for the resurrection. You don't think parts of the New Testament are historic reliable? Fine, doesn't matter. You don't think that what Jesus has recorded as saying in the Gospels is very trustworthy historically? Doesn't matter. Throw all that out. The only thing we focus on in this argument is the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. That's why it's called the minimal facts argument sometimes. Gary Habermas is somebody very well known for making this argument and doing it well. Several books he has out there. Been a professor at Liberty University for decades now. But he uses, to build his argument, he uses only these minimal facts which are agreed upon by virtually all New Testament scholars, Christian, non-Christian scholars, and that are extremely well evidenced. And if you remember, we went through all of these facts. These are the minimal facts. Virtually all scholars agree. He has a list. He's compiled a list of 3,000 to 4,000 scholars over the last 50 years, working in English, German, and French, and can show virtually all of them affirm these facts, except number 4, right? He's aware that only 3/4 of scholars would affirm that fact. But the way to run this argument, the way to run this case for Jesus' resurrection, is to lay out these facts that virtually everybody agrees on, and then ask, what is the best explanation for these facts? And the conclusion is that Jesus literally rose from the dead. You can take other theories, and we did that week, if you remember, other theories like the swoon theory, or the disciples stole the body theory, or the substitution theory, and you can run those theories by the facts and show how they don't measure up as well as the literal resurrection theory. So I'm going to pause again now and let you guys discuss for a few minutes, the 2 main arguments that we've covered over the semester. Which one did you prefer? Which one did you find more compelling? The umbrella case, where we're trying to establish the historical reliability of the New Testament in total. And since that describes his miracles, if we establish the New Testament's historically reliable, then whatever it says we can trust historically, and it describes his miracles, therefore that provides evidence. Or this alternative argument, and they complement each other, but you can see how they're a little bit different. This other argument that solely focuses in on Jesus' resurrection, the minimal facts argument. Which one do you like? Which one do you think is more compelling? And then defend your case. All right, go ahead and discuss that at your table for a few minutes. these little snippets, these little opportunities for you guys to converse, I hope is just the beginning of the conversation, right? Whether it's afterwards when we eat the rest of the food, or whether it's tomorrow over coffee, or next week while you're playing basketball, I hope that these conversations continue, and we're giving you enough fuel, to spark good conversations with people about evaluating the claims of Christianity. That's part of what Ratio Christi is all about, is we want to expose, of course we're making a case for our beliefs, but we want to expose people to why we believe these things are true and to get people talking about them. So there's a sense in which I've saved the best for last. We're going to look at number 7, and this is some new material that we haven't covered yet this semester. And the way that I like to set this up is, we talk a lot about Jesus' miracles, we talk a lot about his resurrection, and it is unfortunate that we don't get to see them with our own eyes, right? That would be better, right? Let's admit that. If we got to see them with our own eyes, I think that would be even more compelling, right? So somebody here a couple weeks ago asked some good questions about, why didn't Jesus stay here in his resurrected, new, glorified body? Why didn't he stay on earth longer? I mean, what if he would have just lived for then hundreds of years afterwards, stayed on earth even till today? And yes, that would be more evidence, if you will. And why didn't God do that? It's his prerogative. I don't know his motivations. He decided not to do that, as the way that I understand it. But yeah, more evidence is always better. And eyewitness evidence, like we've been saying all semester, is the best. And so if we were able to witness some things with our own eyes, I think that would even provide more and more powerfully compelling evidence. Well, here, with this last one, I think there's a sense in which this is a miracle you can see with your own eyes. It takes a little bit of work, it takes a little bit of research, but I think if somebody is willing to put in the effort, I think that they can witness with their own eyes a miracle. And I've found, when I became a Christian when I was 17, and then when I really struggled with knowing whether Christianity was true or not, all throughout my 20s, this is one of the things that really convinced me that I should trust Jesus Christ as my Savior. This was one of the things that really convinced and compelled me to believe that Christianity is true. Again, not claiming absolute certainty, it's still a matter of trust, like everything in life, but I think there's so much good reasons and evidence that our trust is founded on that it gives you that sort of confidence that you're trusting in something dependable. That's why we look at these reasons and evidence. So, hopefully I've set it up well, and here's what it is. Number 7. Let's say the person on the street making the case that their friend Joshua is God in the flesh is able to show you upwards to 70 prophecies that were made before Joshua was even born, some of them hundreds of years before Joshua was born, that he fulfilled. 70 prophecies that he fulfilled. I think that would, in a sense, be that bullseye. It's a cumulative case. There's lots of reasons. If all we had was number 1, I'd be like, well, maybe the other couple billion people in the world are right. But if you add all these things together, again, a cumulative case, I think it's fairly overwhelming. I find it overwhelming to believe that Jesus is God. So I want to tell you, or I just want to walk you through 2 of these prophecies. There's around 70 of them, as I said. They're Old Testament prophecies that Jesus fulfilled in various ways. And you can count them in different ways, right? But most people would agree there's around 70. Now we know, our skeptical red flags might go up right away. But some things that we know for sure. we know for sure that the Old Testament was written before Jesus was born. Okay? So we know these 70 prophecies weren't made up afterwards. All right? One of the reasons we know that is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. You might know a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were found in what? The 40s, I believe. 1940s. But when folks discovered these Dead Sea Scrolls, they date back to 100 BC. And within the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found portions of all of the Old Testament books. And some of them they found in their entirety. Old Testament books. All of them but Esther. All of them but Esther. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated 100 BC. So we just know from that alone, plus many other reasons, that the Old Testament was written before Jesus. Now, of these 70 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, the one that I find most powerful comes from Daniel 9. Now, those of you who maybe grew up in church or have been exposed to Christianity have heard about Daniel, the classic Sunday school stories about Daniel in the lion's den and Shadrach, Meshach, and a bumblebee, you know, those guys. Great Sunday school fodder, good, fun, moral teaching in the first part of the book of Daniel. But in the last part of the book of Daniel, which usually isn't covered in Sunday school, there is some incredible prophecies in there. And the one we're going to focus on is Daniel 9. So in Daniel 9, the person, Daniel, gets a vision or a prophecy from God. And God, in that vision, tells Daniel when the Messiah is going to come. So he gives Daniel a timeline, about a 500-year timeline, predicting when the Messiah will arrive on the scene. So in other words, God gave Daniel this prophecy predicting when the Messiah would come, about 500 years, and I'll give you the details here in a minute. But just to give you some historical context here, so this was during the Babylonian captivity, or the Babylonian exile. If you know the New Testament, or if you just know history in general, the Jews were taken out of Israel to Babylon really as slaves. King Nebuchadnezzar, one of the world's first world empires, Babylon, pretty much conquered the entire world, including Jerusalem. And Nebuchadnezzar and his army came in and destroyed Jerusalem and took all of the Israelites out of Israel to Babylon, including Daniel and his three friends, as you know. Well, Daniel, it's recorded in the book of Daniel, in Daniel 9, that Daniel is praying to God, and he's asking God about when God was going to restore them back to their country. When was God going to rescue them from the Babylonians and take them back to Israel? It was part of their punishment for things that the Israelites had done, that they were removed from their land and taken off as slaves. But God had promised that he was going to return them back to Israel. So in this context of Daniel 9, Daniel's praying to God, and he's asking God about, when are you going to restore us back to our land? When are you going to rescue us from the Babylonians? God answers that question for Daniel, but God continues and gives him even more information about his future plans. And it's in this context that God tells Daniel his plan to save the world. His plan not only to save Israel from the Babylonians, but his plan to rescue mankind from our own evil. So it's in this context in Daniel 9 that God explains someday he's going to send a Messiah who will, listen to this, you can read Daniel 9 later if you want, I'm just going to summarize it for you. But in Daniel 9, God tells Daniel that this Messiah is going to put an end to sin. He's going to atone for iniquity, kind of churchy words. All it means is that he's going to pay the price, or he's going to be a substitute for our evil, for our sins. He's going to atone for them. And he's going to bring in everlasting righteousness. So this Messiah, God explaining to Daniel, is going to come and accomplish those things. And he's going to do that. And then God gives him a timeline as to when exactly this is going to happen. This is famously known as Daniel's 70 weeks. When is the Messiah going to accomplish these things? And it's a little bit strange to our Western English ears, because in this prophecy, God talks to Daniel about these 70 weeks. But in this context and in that language, when he uses the word week, he's meaning 7 years. So we normally use the term week to talk about 7 days. In this context, it's a week of years, so 7 years. So in other words, 70 weeks then means 490 years. God is telling Daniel then that the Messiah is going to come and accomplish these things, end sin, atone iniquity, and bring in everlasting righteousness in 490 years. Well, when's the clock going to start? This is a very specific prophecy. That's why I find it to be so remarkable. It's not just a general, Nostradamus type thing. It's very specific. And the clock doesn't start right there in the prayer. It's not like, Daniel's praying and God tells him this and says the clock starts right now. Count 490 years from now, it's going to happen. No, there's a specific historic event that's going to take place soon, and that's when this clock will start, so to speak. God explains that the clock, this prophetic clock, if you will, is going to start with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Now remember what's going on historically. The Israelites are in Babylon. Israel, Jerusalem, the temple has been destroyed. God has promised he's going to restore them back to their land, and they'll rebuild the temple. And when the decree is given for them to rebuild the temple, that's when this prophetic clock begins. And we just know this from history, biblical history as well as extra-biblical sources, that this decree was given in 445 BC. It was given by the Persian king. You know from history that the Persians, the Medes and Persians, overthrew the Babylonians. They were the next world empire. So the king of Persia made this decree. And one thing that the Persian king did when they took over from the Babylonians is they allowed a lot of the people that the Babylonians had ripped from their homelands, allowed them to move back. And the Israelites were just one of them. We know this from history. There's even archaeological evidence of the Persian king giving these proclamations, letting people go back to their homeland. But in 445 precisely is when the king of Persia gave the decree to the Israelites that they could go back and rebuild their capital, Jerusalem. So that's when the prophetic clock began. This is all laid out in Daniel 9. So the next part gets a little bit confusing. Let me walk you through it. God goes on while he's describing these things to Daniel. He said, look, there's going to be 7 sevens, then 62 sevens. Remember, sevens is a week of years. So 7 sevens and 62 sevens, and the Messiah will be cut off. Now, God's already said he's going to accomplish these things, atone for sin, bring in everlasting righteousness. He's going to accomplish that in 490 years. But after 483 of those years, the Messiah is going to be cut off. And any more explanation there is given as to what this means. And it sounds very odd, the Messiah being cut off. What could that mean? It sounds like the Messiah is going to fail. However, he just a couple verses before explained all these things that the Messiah was going to accomplish. But then he says he's going to be cut off. He's going to fail. Now we know after the fact how he accomplished those things by failing, by being cut off, by dying. But to Daniel, I'm sure it was very confusing. How could he fail by accomplishing? Or how could he accomplish these things by failing, by being cut off? Now, if you take this 445, maybe you've already done the math, you engineers in the room. If you take this 445 BC and you run forward the prophetic clock as God told Daniel to do so, it lands you right into the AD 30s. There's some discussion on exactly how to measure years or how they thought of years back then. If they thought of years as 365 days or 360 days. Regardless, it gets you to the AD 30s. And you know what? That's close enough for me. It's kind of like if somebody said, you're going to break your arm. Somebody is prophesying, and they said, you're going to break your arm the first week of February. Now, if you break your arm on the Tuesday of that week or the Friday of that week, it's still impressive that they prophesied you were going to do that. Unless they're the ones that break your arm, I guess. That wouldn't be very impressive. But you know what I'm saying. If it happens within that general time frame, it doesn't have to be to the second. And depending how different cultures have measured years, 360 days, and then they add in a little bit of time every once in a while, right? Whereas 365, it gets you to the AD 30s. And that's why I find this to be such an impressive prophecy. Now we're going to end the night with one other. And I think if you take Daniel 9, the Messiah is going to accomplish these great things, but he's going to do it by being cut off. You take that kind of mysterious language and you add it with this other Old Testament prophecy, it really explains the whole gospel. It explains exactly what Jesus did and accomplished through the cross. So this other compelling Old Testament prophecy comes from the book of Isaiah. This is the famous prophecy in Isaiah 53. I won't read it in Hebrew for you. I'll read it in English. But I do want to read it tonight so you can see. This gives a picture, a more precise picture, if you will, about how the Messiah would accomplish these things by being cut off. Now, I do want you to know that Jews, Israelites, interpreted this Isaiah 53 as a messianic prophecy all the way up until the 1100s. Nowadays, most Jews will say, nah, this really wasn't talking about the Messiah. This is talking more about the nation of Israel. But before 1100 AD, Jews saw this as a messianic prophecy. And as I read it here, I think you'll see that it fits Jesus of Nazareth to a T. And again, I think it explains well how he accomplished these things by being cut off. So listen to this. This is Isaiah 53. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we did not esteem him. He's talking like in a past tense, but he's prophesying about the coming Messiah. Surely our griefs he himself bore, our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. He was pierced through for our transgressions, our sins, our evil choices. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we're healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own selfish ways. But the Lord has caused all of our evil, our iniquity, to fall on him. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he never opened his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that is silent before its shearers. He did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was, get this, that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased, God was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, because he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many, and he interceded for the transgressors, for those who commit evil, selfishness, pride. So I find this is just 2 out of the 70, but I find these to be the 2 most compelling Old Testament prophecies. So that kind of puts us now at 7 overall good reasons to think that Jesus really is God. And nobody else in history has, had all of these things line up for them, so to speak, this combination of things. Of course, a lot of people have claimed to be God, but this Jesus of Nazareth has so much going for him to convince me that he really is God. It's just too much to be coincidence. Well, that's the semester. That's our theme for this semester, making the case that Jesus is God. Here's several ways that you can jump in to getting involved. The semester is kind of winding down. We're only going to do 1 more day of tabling, and it's not this week. It's next week, but we'll tell you about that. Next week, we'll take the week off for Thanksgiving, and we're going to have a movie night at our house, me and Kristen's house, and then we'll have our Christmas party, and then we'll wrap up the semester. But keep helping us get the word out there. Let your church know, let your pastor know. We want to serve local churches. We want to speak to youth groups, college groups, and serve people by giving them these good reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true. Well, we like to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So what questions were sparked in your mind tonight as we went through this? I know it was a little bit of review, a little bit of new information. What jumped out at you? What can I try to be helpful with about? Or anybody online watching?
So you talked about the 77s, and then you moved to a 69 sevens. What happened to the 77?
I'm glad you caught that. Yeah, it's interesting. The way that God lays it out, he says to Daniel, the Messiah is going to accomplish these things within 490 years. But then he says, at 483, the Messiah is cut off. So there's this hanging 7-year period out there. And theologians disagree on how to interpret this. But the way that I understand it, based on my study, is that this hanging 7-year period Here's might be the best way to explain it, as I understand it. It's like this prophetic clock was clicking away, clicking away, clicking away. 483 came on the clock, and the Messiah was cut off, and he accomplished mostly these things. But at that point, when he was cut off, it's like the clock stopped. So you've got this hanging 7-year period that is yet to be fulfilled. So at some point, the way that dispensational theologians understand it is that someday this clock will begin again, and there'll be a 7-year period sometime in the future where these things will be fully accomplished. So in other words, the way to understand this simply, I think, is Jesus came, died on the cross, accomplished these things by dying on the cross for our sins, giving us an opportunity to be forgiven and reconciled back to God through faith in Him. But yet, Jesus is going to come back someday to accomplish the rest of His agenda, right? To bring in everlasting righteousness, to once and for all judge the world, right? To make all the wrongs right, to fix everything. Because even though Jesus came, again, I'm talking as a Christian theologian here, even though Jesus came and He opened up this door for us to be forgiven through what He did on the cross, there's still a lot of crap in the world, right? I don't think we would say that we're in everlasting righteousness yet. Yes, we have that through Christ, but it seems like, based on these Old Testament prophecies, even more was going to be accomplished. And so most theologians would say that this 7-year period is still yet to be accomplished. And then, as Christians, when you turn to the book of Revelation, those 7 years are discussed. It's the 7 years of tribulation. That 7-year period is when, still yet future, these things will ultimately be accomplished, and everlasting righteousness will be brought, not just us going to heaven, but heaven being brought to earth. So I think all that is packaged into Daniel 9 without a full, elaborate explanation. It's a 483, and then the Messiah is cut off, but then there's a hanging 7, and then in the New Testament it's explained more how that hanging 7 is yet to be fulfilled in the future. And Jesus talks about it, and Revelation is very explicit about the 7-year tribulation period. Good. Any other questions? Anybody online have a question? This is a very fascinating study of Old Testament prophecy. I mean, there's books and studies. You can just walk through these 70 prophecies. And again, to me, it's like looking at a miracle with your own eyes. All right, well, thanks for coming tonight, guys. There's still some food over there left. And last I heard, checked on my phone, it wasn't raining, so hopefully you won't have to walk home in the rain. But you guys are always welcome to stay afterwards and chat, keep having this conversation. So appreciate you guys coming.